Hi, I'm Quentin Schultz, author of the book Communicating with Grace and Virtue. And in this video series, I'm looking at each of the chapters, just taking a little bit of the material from each chapter, developing it, adding something else, going in a slightly different direction from the book. It's just great fun. I love this material so much, and I'm really grateful that you are willing to watch along with me. The book is inexpensive. If you have an opportunity, pick up a copy as well. I think you'll be pleased. If not, send me a note, but be gentle. Good communication. Thank you so much. Okay, here we go. Chapter 5 is about embracing communication for community. For community. Well, it turns out, of course, that communication and community come from the same root word, a Latin root that means essentially to make common. To make common. So what's happening with all communication that's actually working as communication is it's creating shared understanding so that we have understanding in common. When we don't have anything in common, we don't communicate and we don't have community. Communities are made up of people who have something in common, and they create that commonality through communication. It's quite a remarkable gift that we have to be able to do this. Some of it is intentional and some of it's unintentional. So the intentional is obvious. We form a community, we communicate, we make the community happen. For example, a church forms a community, uses communication of different forms to have a congregation. Well, what about the unintentional? This is interesting. So here's some truth that we all know, but it can be a little distressing. Our children become somewhat like us. They become somewhat like us. They move around like us. They walk like us. They talk like us. They use similar language to us. So it's not just what we intentionally tell our children, you should be like this, you should do this, and so on. It's also what they pick up. And so we get to a certain point in our lives as adults, if we have children, they start moving into adulthood and we say, boy, they're somewhat like us, and they've picked up some of the things that I wish they hadn't. So it is with unintentional communication. So we build community through communication, and part of it's intentional and part of it's unintentional. Second, we form shared identities through communication. We form shared identities. Our identity, our sense of self, comes through communication with others. So who are we? Are we Canadian, let's say? Are we Michiganders like I am? There's language we use which self-identifies us. And of course, today, there are a lot of quote unquote identity groups in society. So we might talk about African Americans or Hispanics who identify because they have something in common, partly through communication. So we form our identities partly through communication, our shared identities. Third, communication equips us for intimacy, intimate communication, intimate community, or we might even say communion. In the early church, the principal way that people got together in person and expressed their common identity in Christ was through the sacrament of communion. Again, communion, community, communication. Very, very important in the early church for them. And so we could say that all of our intimacies at whatever level and with any people are formed through communication. Our intimacy with God, let's say, through prayer, our intimacy with a loved one that we get together with and we share things about each other that we don't necessarily share with anyone else, including having secrets and keeping those secrets. Fourth, communication helps us build trust or distrust. So we come to know one another and decide whether or not we trust one another through communication. And then if someone does something that breaks that trust, we have to decide what to do. Do we try to rebuild it? Do we let it go? Does it permanently injure the relationship or even dissolve the relationship. I'd like to talk a little bit more about this particular aspect of communication because it's so important. In a sense, distrust is anti-community. So communication that produces distrust tends to dissolve, erode, tarnish community, really tarnish all of our relationships. Now, what about lying? There is a rather specific notion of lying in the history of scholarship about lying, and I still use it. I think it's the best one to use. A lie is a statement intended to deceive, a statement intended to deceive. So if we intentionally know that something we are saying to someone else or writing them or texting them is not true, we are lying. If what we thought we were communicating is true, based on our own best understanding of it, then we have not lied. We've misinformed, we've miscommunicated, but we haven't lied. So I try to live a life that says stay away from all lies because they will destroy community. They are anti-community. But what about white lies? Suppose my wife comes into the room, she's got a new dress on, and she says, "Darling, how does it look?" And what if I think it looks pretty good, but not great? Should I say wonderful? I'm being intentionally deceptive there. Or suppose I go out to dinner and our hosts are serving the food, no one says anything, and then one of the preparers of the food says, "So what do you think about the food, Quinn?" And suppose I don't like it. Or suppose I don't like one of the items, the broccoli or the cauliflower. So these are white lies. They're lies that are not of great moral importance. They're not going to destroy relationships. They're not so much anti-community. And here's the other thing. We all know that they exist, and we all do white lies. It's just part of life. So I do engage in some white lies here and there. What about flattery, where we build up people? We know that what we're saying is over the top. You are the greatest this, or you did the best job on this I've ever seen, or you look better in that suit than you've ever looked in anything else you've worn. We know it's flattery. What do we do with flattery? Well, you decide for yourself. Can flattery destroy community? Not so much. There are probably times and places for it. But if it's going to make a difference in a relationship, we probably want to stay away from flattery. Maybe just a little bit of flattery. Now, Scripture is certainly against lies, and it's certainly against flattery because some people just go overboard, I think, with flattery. And so you don't know whether or not you can trust them. And in those cases, it does harm relationships. I'd like to talk also about diversity in communication. Now, this is such a great topic. In one sense, diversity offers capacity so that people from different backgrounds, different life experiences, bring to the table in their communication not only different ways of communicating, but also different life experience. So when we get diversity of people involved in communication, it can bring great capacity. And generally speaking, an organization or relationship is going to be better if there's some diversity of background and experience. But diversity, second, also produces conflict because we have differences. And so we don't agree on certain things. Our backgrounds maybe lead us there, or we have a different perspective because of our life experience. What do we do with that? Well, such conflict can be beneficial if it helps us understand one another and the broader community, but it can also tear apart relationships and tear apart organizations. So we need diversity for improvement and growth and creativity in all types of community and relationships, yet diversity can also be a problem. Now, third, there's a diversity of personality trait, and this is one that we don't take nearly as seriously as we should. So we are all different somewhat in personality. There are 5 major personality traits in the studies that hold up over time. I put 3 of them here just for you to think about it. Differences of people in terms of how ambitious they are. Now, I'm an ambitious person, and I communicate ambitiously. I want to make things happen. And that gets me into trouble sometimes because people are, whoa, what's wrong with that guy? He's kind of pushy. And I do come across as pushy. I'm ambitious. Agreeableness, how agreeable someone is or not, and openness. These are differences of personality traits that come into our relationships, our communities, our social institutions, including like our families and our churches and our neighborhoods. And they can all be for good capacity, but they can also create conflict. What about gender and sex differences? This is really a tough one. I've looked periodically at the latest literature on the differences between, let's say, how male and female people communicate. Now, I don't want to get into all of the complexities of what's sex and what's gender and what we're born with and what we gain through culture. There's a lot there. But I do want to say this. There seems to be in the literature an understanding that males and females, to some extent, communicate differently. And they bring different things to their communication, different observations and backgrounds and assumptions. To put it in a nutshell, men are more interested in communicating about things, and women are more interested in communicating about people. Men talk about things, women tend to talk about people or relationships, we could say. This is not true of all people, male, female, and difference. And it's a generalization, but it has some truth. I want to tell one interesting story about this. Years ago, my wife and I used to go down to Chicago every Thanksgiving to get with extended family on her side. We would drive down there from where we're living in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And then I would come in the front door and all the women were automatically gathering in the kitchen. And they were talking about things while they made the food. And then the men would all gather in the family room and they would have football on and they would be watching football and occasionally grunting. Yeah, oh, get him, oh. And whenever I would try to start a somewhat deeper conversation about what was going on in the lives of those of us who were male, I couldn't get anywhere. So every year when we would leave, we'd be in the car, the kids would fall asleep, we're driving back, and I would turn to my wife and I would say, dear, so what's the latest family news? What's happening in the family? Who should we be praying for? Because the men wouldn't talk about people. They would talk about things like footballs and the guys in football, but not about relationships. So there is some gender sex difference here. Ethnic and cultural variations are huge in communication. And we can get into trouble so fast when we don't take this into account. People who perceive things differently because of their ethnic cultural backgrounds. It can be good, it can be bad. My wife and I were in Guatemala and we were in a garbage dump area and we people trying to eke out a living, taking stuff out of the garbage there. And we ended up having lunch with a woman and her child. They traded off some bottles that were not broken that they had found in the dump for some eggs. And then we had eggs and tomatoes with them and had a tremendous conversation about their lives, about their Christian faith. Materially, they had little. Their faith was absolutely remarkable. And my wife and I both were transformed by that single communicative experience with her in that that barrio down there. Cross-cultural communication, hard but important. And finally, religious traditions. We all have different religious traditions, even if they're slight, a denomination or a particular church or whatever. And communicating across religious divisions can be quite difficult. And it can create problems. And it can even, let's say, just within a Christian tradition, traditions within traditions. And so when I would teach about this in terms of communication, I would say to my students, know what the negotiables and the non-negotiables are of your faith for your own communication. What makes someone a Christian or a follower of Christ, we could say? Is it adult baptism, infant baptism? And I would say, you know, I favor infant baptism, and I'll argue theologically for it. But I'm not willing to put that in the category of what makes someone a Christian if they believe that or not. That's a negotiable for me. As a way of trying to get at this, to make communication possible among Christians who have some different beliefs. So there you have it, looking at communication and community, and about diversity, and hoping that I'm helping you think through how diversity is both capacity and also conflict. And we always need to be aware of what we're doing that will build community, build relationships, and destroy them, tear them down. I'm Quentin Schultz, author of this book, Communicating with Grace and Virtue. If you're interested, please do pick up a copy. I'm grateful that you tuned in here and looked at this video. Thanks so much. Peace to you.